Hello, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Geneva Trade Week. Welcome to the event on green and sustainable recovery, role of circular economy, and role of trade in all of that. So my name is Marianne Kettunen. I'll be your host and moderator this morning. And I come from an Institute for European Environmental Policy, IEP, that is a think tank based in Brussels and the UK. And we have a really large joint event today, hosted by a number of organizations in addition to IEP, as you've seen from our logos. So it's really a joint effort, team effort between a range of organizations, which include the permanent mission of Finland to Geneva, permanent mission of the Netherlands to Geneva, the World Economic Forum, International Trade Center, UN Economic Commission for Europe, the International Institute for Sustainable Development, IISD, Finnish Innovation Fund, Sitra as well. So as said, joint effort by a range of organizations who are all really interested and passionate about these three different themes that we brought together here. And the reason why we wanted to host this event is because obviously the COVID pandemic continues to reshape our economies and societies as we speak. And we are trying to search ways how to recover. And while recovering, we're trying to find ways how to build back better, how to build back more green, and how to build back more sustainable. And governments are currently putting immense amount of funding to build back. And also there is a lot of talk about doing it better, doing it more greener. And also at the same time, businesses are looking at the new ways to be able to deal with this new situation and find ways to find new business models in the new normal, new future that we're facing. So basically the question we want to explore in this event is how and what does it mean to build back better, and what role can trade play in building back better? And in this context, to build back better, a lot of hopes and dreams for sustainability are pinned on the shift to circular economy. And what circular economy means is basically using resources in a circular, more efficient manner, basically using old resources instead of new resources. And what this means is putting less pressure on the ecosystems and biodiversity, and also using less energy compared to using new resources and creating things from scratch. So that also means being more low carbon than before. So that's kind of, the idea behind the circular economy and why circular economy should be the key to build back better. So what we're exploring then is, what does it mean to be green sustainable recovery, and what role can circular economy play in that, and how can trade support circular economy globally in this context? We'll be specifically looking at the role of businesses in this context, so how trading services and goods based on circular models can be part of the building back better in the future. We'll be also specifically looking at how can developing economies globally benefit from the shift to circular economy in a global scale, particularly supporting their rebuilding in the future. And we will try to identify recommendations for policymakers regarding trade while we go through these discussions today. So for practical information, we have a panel discussion of around 60 minutes that we start off with. We have a chat with very acknowledgeable panelists representing different views of these topics. This will be followed by a discussion with the audience around 30 minutes. Our panel is going to be an interview style. We don't have any slides, but we have a chat with people with questions and thoughts and ideas. And then when we move on to the comments and thoughts from the audience, we have a couple of front row comments from the organizers lined up, and then we will be having questions from you listeners to the panel as well. In terms of your questions, and this is important, so anybody who's listening and following, please use the chat function to put your questions to the panelists. You can direct them to a specific panelist in terms of mentioning their name, or you can just put them out there in general, and I'll be directing them to the panel when we finally end up with the discussion part of the session. So please think about your questions. Please, while you're listening to panelists as well, already start writing your questions there, so we'll pick them up. So with that introduction, I would like to turn to our first panelist, who is Professor Anthony Young. Anthony is the Director for Climate Change and Green Growth at the African Development Bank, and I could not think of anybody better placed to kick off this conversation this morning to give us a bit of a scene in terms of how the impacts of the pandemic have been on the African continent, and what role perhaps a circular economy could play in the recovery in the future. So, Anthony, welcome, and glad you could join us this morning. And apologies for the very early hour that it is where you at in Côte d'Ivoire. Anthony, can you hear me? Okay, are you there?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Super. So we can have a conversation. That's
Thank
great.
you, yes.
Good morning. So
yeah, good morning.
My first question to you is to set the scene is that what kind of key impacts or trends have you and the African Development Bank observed in terms of green growth and environment due to the COVID across Africa? Have there been some key sectors, some key green sectors have been hit hard, for example, tourism? And have there been any sectors that have been actually more resilient towards the pandemic? So, what's the situation based on your view and your pick of the trends at the moment?
Yeah, thank you so very much, Marianne. This is and thanks for inviting the African Development Bank to be a part of this very important seminar. Well, let me start by saying that for the African continent, we have one single goal to see to the economic growth of the African continent. So anything that threatens that growth actually threatens our mandate, because we know that the needs for development in Africa are huge. So what we have seen with the coronavirus is we have seen a reversal of the gains we have made as a continent over the past 10 to 20 years. A lot of those resources, a lot of the development gains made, a lot of the, have been basically erased. And that's unfortunate. This is unfortunate because it's coming at a time that we are seeing so many other things happening related to climate change. For instance, we are experiencing the worst kinds of droughts in Southern Africa. We're seeing floods even in the Sahel. We're seeing the desert locust taking place, ravaging farms in Eastern Africa, and we're seeing a hurricane buildup in this season. All these are happening when African countries have really taken a hit with the COVID-19. And what has happened is, I'm sure that is the story in most other places. Countries have had to take monies that were meant for other developmental sectors, and channel them into just trying to flatten a curve. It's not contributing so much to development, but rather, how can they flatten the COVID-19 curve? That's money taken away from health, money taken away from education, from energy, from transportation, and so on. So we're seeing that happen. And for us, what we've seen hit the most is tourism, is agriculture. Those economies that depend largely on commodities, rock, the environment depends so much on just direct purchase and sales of commodities. I'll give you an instance. With the lockdown that happened, we know people didn't travel, and there are countries who derive a significant portion of their income through tourism, wildlife they come to see, they travel. But because of the lockdown, people couldn't travel. So we've seen countries suffer hugely. Kenya, for instance, Seychelles. These are darling countries where people travel to, but the fleets were really down, and so the travels weren't as much and could not earn them the revenue that they were earning. But then there are also bright lights around somewhere. Somebody once said, never let a crisis go to waste. How can we take advantage of that present crisis? And we've seen sectors that were not initially considered green now getting into that space. Textiles, for instance. If you come around the continent, you see that the wearing of a mask is not just health, but is a fashion statement, And so you find clothes that could have been thrown out because they were too tiny to be useful to anybody have now been converted to non-disposable face masks, And that's we are seeing people take advantage of the fourth industrial revolution. We're seeing African countries use 3D printing to print face masks, the protective shield. We're seeing people use technologies now to deliver drugs through drones, and thereby cutting the need to travel. We're seeing, opportunities coming up also. So while we look at the impact, I also would want that let's not dwell so much on the impact. The impacts are good for us to know, but in this crisis, what can we do differently? Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. And that's definitely, the way to try to look at it. Turn a good crisis into something that pushes us into a better future, indeed. And I guess that brings me to my second question is, what do you or African Development Bank more broadly see as the key developments now needed to build on these positives that have perhaps come out of it, and build and help build a sustainable recovery across the African continent? You said, tourism and agriculture sector have been the ones suffering, but there are other sectors, like you said, for example, textiles. That's perhaps showing that it can recover quicker or in different ways. So, what would be like 2 to 3 key ways or key developments that need to happen for African continent or countries to recover? And indeed, bringing us to today's discussion, what role do you see that green trade can play here? So what would be the message also in this context to the trade community, what one can do? And obviously, of course, the circular economy linking to textiles as well. So concretely, what would you see that, would be the ways forward here?
Yeah, thanks so much again. I think for us, let's the role of policy is extremely very important. We cannot afford to treat COVID-19 as A, something different, and then our national development as B, something different. There has to be an integration. The attempts, the efforts we make at addressing COVID-19 must be embedded within our national development processes that tells us how do we address this while progressing, while still charting a development pathway, while doing things differently. So in that, 3 things came to my mind. The first is the role of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. This is a very powerful initiative that has been established by African countries, that it allows us to boost the creation of regional value chains, which you would probably can do at a global trade because of how certain commodities like plastics are classified. But locally, we know that they can boost trade, create jobs, among certain groups of people. Then the other thing I want to talk about is the role of leadership. Most of the time people think Africa is a country. This 55 independent sovereign nations, but we come together, And one of those examples is where the African Union chair, the South African president, His Excellency Cyril Ramaphosa, as the chair of the African Union, got together at the beginning of the pandemic, realizing that these are not things that respect borders. The COVID-19 does not respect borders. So if you are in Nigeria, you cannot say, well, I've secured mine and leave Cameroon to sort theirs out. We needed a collective decision. So it was able to mobilize countries together, all African countries together, around a common theme, around a common fund, to address this at the continental level. And I'm pleased to state that the African Development Bank contributed $27 million to that fund because we believe there are certain things that need to be done at the continental level. The third thing that we've seen happening, which is very important, is that general awareness of the need to build back better. Everyone says we don't like where we are. We can't go back to where we were that put us in this present trouble today. How can we do things differently? So with that general awareness, it becomes easy for us. For instance, the African Development Bank has set up what we call the COVID-19 response facility that basically helps countries in doing two things: flatten your curve and also chart a pathway for a green recovery. We have successfully and carefully mainstreamed climate change, circular economy into that facility so that any results that goes out of that facility must demonstrate that it has addressed the issues of environment, climate change, and that where opportunities exist, that circularity has been built into the investments there. So that is very important, and we're seeing that across several countries that have provided that have provided stimulus packages for recovery, that they are building in opportunities for circularity, building in opportunities to mainstream climate change, because they all link together. Someone once said, look, if we are not careful, we will be jumping from the frying pan of COVID-19 into the fire of climate change disasters. And as at that time, we would have run out of fire extinguishers. So this is the time to do both of them simultaneously. And trade plays a very important role there.
That's great. Thank you so much, Anthony, for that. Because basically, I was already thinking in my mind, asking you the question as to, what role can you see circular economy playing in this, and what interest and leadership are the countries on the African continent showing to take up a circular economy? And you basically have already answered that question, which is that there is interest across different countries, and that African Development Bank is actively supporting countries to pick up that interest as well. I guess my final question to you in that very space would simply be, again, in the space of setting the scene at this stage, is can you say anything how to say of the scale that circular economy related initiatives and business opportunities could play across the continent and across different countries? Do you see that that every country around the continent could really significantly benefit of the opportunities linked to circular economy, also in terms of businesses and creating economies building on that? Or do you see that perhaps there are some countries that could benefit more than the others? So how is it that in terms of the scale of opportunity, could the circular economy related opportunities be helping to build back and also compensate perhaps what the problems have been, or how the tourism sector and also the agriculture sector have taken a hit, and also of course helping the tourism and agriculture sector as well to be more circular?
Thanks again. Let me state here that every country has an opportunity to implement a circular economy. Every country, because there's no country that I know that doesn't produce, doesn't manufacture, or doesn't consume. We have that. And so the first point is, how have we mainstreamed sustainable consumption and production systems into our national strategies? Bigger economies may have bigger opportunities, but smaller countries, smaller opportunities, but within their context, these are huge. We're not going to compare Burundi with, say, Morocco, because for Burundi, it's important that they do it either in the agriculture sector, in the manufacturing sector, in the mining sector. So it is absolutely very important that every opportunity, every country takes advantage of the opportunities. And let me tell you what the African continent is doing. Where we see opportunities, what the bank and partners like you do is to explore and point to those opportunities and provide the enabling environment for those opportunities to be taken, then you will see that it blooms naturally. I'll give you an instance. The cell phone. There was a time that access to a telephone line was an indicator of human development. It was a very important human development index. How many telephone lines do you have per 100 or per 1,000 people? While many African countries had not even gotten to that point of owning telephone lines, what happened when the cell phones came? We leapfrogged the landlines and then embraced the cell phones. Not only did we embrace the cell phone, we created products out of them. Mobile money is become global. And I believe that same opportunity exists in the circular economy. Once countries begin to see the advantage, see the jobs that can be created, see the way that it acts as a catalyst to doing things differently. Africa, most of African countries are underdeveloped. It's a blessing in disguise. It gives us the opportunity to do things better the first time than to retrofit. So for us, that's where we're pushing. How can we do it differently the first time? And circular economy provides that opportunity for us to be efficient. Africa is a low-emitting continent, everyone knows. But when you look at the intensity of emissions per production unit, Africa is very high. That's not right. How can we create that efficiency in our production systems? How can we reduce that intensity that our manufacturing systems are known for? I think it is important that every country recognizes that there are opportunities in there. It's not a Western concept, it's not a Northern concept. It basically sits well that we collectively are exceeding our planetary boundaries in the way we consume resources. Several years ago, we published a document with the WWF, Africa's Ecological Footprint, that showed everyone talked about the rich diversity of Africa's nature and abundant resources, but the truth is that it is being depleted very fast. We cannot sustain that. You cut, you use, you dispose. We will run out of resources. So that became a clarion call 11 years ago that Africa needs to embark on a journey of circularity in its economic development. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. I could quiz you for a long time because it's such an interesting conversation to be had with you on this, but I think we'll have to move on now for the other panelists and then circle back to you when we have comments as well. But basically your message is across the continent of Africa, a circular economy can play a role there. So therefore there is, scale of opportunity there. And obviously trade can be an element helping that as well. And I think you mentioned as well, trade can be an element within the continent of Africa. So trade among African countries, but also obviously then between Africa and the rest of the world as well. So trade can be seen in different scales to support the circular shift on the African continent towards the circular economy as well. But thank you for that for now. And please, audience listening, if you have questions to Anthony and also what Anthony said, comments and thoughts, put them in the chat box and we get back to that later. But with that, I'm going to move on to our next panelist, who is Colette Van Der Ven. Colette is an international trade lawyer at the Tulip Consulting. And what Colette has done is just published a study for the Dutch government and the Dutch representation to Geneva, the WTO, looking at what kind of trade flows there are, and looking at the trade flows in the context of circular economy and opportunities vis-a-vis developing economies. So Colette, my first question to you would be, what types of trends do you see in the trade flows linked to circular economy, particularly vis-a-vis the developing economies now and also expected in the future? And in your view, has the pandemic affected or will it be affecting these trends that you've been able to see? So what's the status that we are currently in and you see where you foresee these trends going as well?
Many thanks, Marianne, and to all the organizers for putting together this panel. I know a lot of work has gone into this. With the Dutch government, we've indeed, as you said, we're launching a study that focuses specifically on what the implications are for developing countries or low-income countries as a result of the world becoming increasingly circular, and specifically with an emphasis on trade. So this is really the crux of the study, and we have benefited enormously from discussions we've had in the last couple of, months pre-COVID, with representatives from developing countries here in Geneva, who have given us a lot of really important insights into their concerns and with respect to the circular economy and their interests in where to take this forward. So the study is really taking that into account and reflects a number of events and luncheons and things like that. And the idea here is for the Dutch government to take this forward and to make sure that the circular economy really is one that's inclusive, not one where more advanced economies are having this debate at the expense of or exclusion of some lesser developed countries. So we hope to continue this debate in that context. So the study, which I believe will be shared later on, or a link will be shared for those interested, as you mentioned, what we've looked into was, well, what are really the implications of a gradual transition to a circular economy with respect to trade with low-income countries? And there's a couple of issues that make this question rather complex. One is the lack of data, which directly relates to the issue of categorization. Most secondary products are defined at national level, whether it is a product for recycling, whether it is a secondhand good, scrap material. And so there is a lot of difficulty in gathering the kind of data that one would need to understand exactly what kind of products are flowing and in what direction. And we'll get back into that a little bit later. The other issue is that whether and how trade will be impacted depends on a number of different variables, including the speed at which different countries are adapting a circular transition, and also the scope thereof. So if you just have, say, the Netherlands going circular, the impact on trade flows will be a lot less than if the entire EU were to embrace these principles and implement them, or say the whole world, right? So there's a lot of unknowns there in sketching these variables, but nevertheless, there are a couple of trends that are predicted that will take place within trade and have impact on developing countries. The first one is a reduced demand on primary raw materials. So as the circular economy aims to keep products longer in the circle of existence, ultimately and basically everything else being equal, this is expected to lead to a reduced demand. This for developing countries can have, or kind of primary materials can have significant implications, especially for those that are commodity dependent. That's very much still these days a bit of a north-south story, where a lot of low-income countries are still predominantly exporting certain types of primary raw materials. So with this movement towards circularity, it basically calls for a change in countries' export baskets and in a move towards enhanced diversification. And there is, of course, there are other factors that would make this probably be something that will take time to materialize, such as population growth, a rising middle class, etc., which kind of points in the other direction with respect to raw material demand, primary raw material demand. But this is one area that's being identified. The flip side of that is a increased demand for secondary raw materials, with a lot of scrap material and things like that that can be reused or reutilized into, for example, in metal, the production of steel and things like that. Some developing countries have actually developed quite a bit of expertise in these markets, such as India. That's home to a lot of the scrap and using scrap into turning it into steel, materials. Then other trends are increasing waste for recycling. This is also, you can see a bit of the ambiguity here. Waste for recycling will increase as a result of the circular economy, and as we try to keep products longer into the cycle. But there's, of course, also the other principle of proximity, where one would say perhaps trading the waste isn't necessarily something that we would want to see in the circular economy. So there are opportunities here. There's also some challenges, and these two elements come together in some of these concepts, but it is predicted to lead to an increase in waste for recycling. Then an increase in trade in secondhand goods. So, things like clothing and cars and also electronics. And, as we no longer try to throw this away, trade in those products will increase. And this is an area where developing countries have raised some concerns because it is often very difficult to ascertain the type of quality of product that is coming into your country, also due to categorizations, etc. We can go into that more. But this has resulted in certain instances and situations where developing countries are getting the types of secondary products that may not necessarily be usable, or that may be hazardous, or that may be unfit for their purposes. So this is also an area that's been flagged. On the other hand, it creates opportunity as well to build new industries around these secondary markets, if you will. Then there is a shift, or an anticipated shift, in trade towards products that meet circular economy standards. So one key measure that governments that are transitioning towards a circular economy are adopting are setting standards. So product needs to be having minimum durability requirements, or have certain eco design elements. That could potentially, or that means that a lot of products that will be traded will ultimately converge towards having some of these higher standards in place. For developing countries, it's again both an opportunity and a challenge. It could be a non-tariff barrier because it may be more difficult to meet some of these standards, but it could also be an opportunity to likewise heighten some standards within developing countries themselves. And then finally, the circular economy is shifting trade and creating opportunities in new service areas that previously weren't really there. So services in basically all the industries around what you would need to become circular, from recycling to remanufacturing to refurbishing to eco design, the designing of products. So that, just to kind of recap, there's a lot of different ways in which trade is predicted to shift. And these are some of the main ones that we've highlighted in the report that will have consequences for developing countries.
Thank you, Colette. It's a really interesting story, that story of trends. And as I think what we hear from you is that it can go either way. It can basically, have opportunities, but it also can turn into something unsustainable unless there's a dialogue between the trade partner countries, including trade partner countries between, the more developed and developing economies. And that's basically also, what you're saying and what you're telling the story is precisely in the same ballpark as we at IP have also looked at in the past, and what our research shows as well, that it can go either way, and now is the time to basically have these dialogues and make sure that trade in circular economy is sustainable, because it's not going to be that by all parties by default, and the opportunities, as Anthony was talking about, aren't going to be just materializing unless there actually is this support also and dialogue between the trade partner countries, for example, between Africa and the other parts of the world as well. So in that vein, my next question, the second question, follow-up question to you is then that, based on what you've seen, what would be maybe one or two key policy actions that we should then take to make sure that trade in circular economy is sustainable in the future, that we basically, end up with trends which are positive and create positive impacts globally, rather than we end up in a sort of trends which are unbalanced between, for example, the developing and developed world, or economies rather. So two key policy actions based on your study and your views.
Yeah, thank you so much. We can talk about this, for the rest of the day, because there's so many things that can be highlighted. But you're absolutely right, Marianne, that in this debate on the circular economy, there's a lot of really positive opportunity that is emerging and that can be really leveraged. At the same time, there are some challenges that must be mitigated, and that is important to be aware of, to make sure that we make the most out of this and that it's an inclusive agenda also for developing countries. So the report talks about a number of different ways in which or action items and that we suggest here. I'm going to highlight two that relate to the same principle, which I think comes really out of some of this research, which is the idea of alignment. and alignment in two different ways. On the one hand, it is absolutely critical if the circular economy were to be leveraged to the maximum in a maximum way, and also be inclusive, that low-income countries are proactive about where the opportunities are within this context, and then align that to their trade policies. So this, because every country is different. Different countries will be depending on different types of raw materials and will have different comparative or nascent comparative advantages in areas that are going to be crucial to building a circular economy. A domestic approach to where are the opportunities and the challenges for me as a country in a gradually circular economy is extremely key, and then that needs to be reflected back in trade agreements. And here, trade agreements and the circular economy is an area which is really under explored at this point. There's a lot of thinking right now emerging in this field, and with COVID-19 this gets accelerated, but there's a couple of ways in which to do that beyond mentioning just countries shall cooperate on the circular economy, because that doesn't really have much teeth. And the ways in which this can be done is by aligning this more proactively, for example, on market access. We heard from Dr. Anthony Ngingung about the AFCFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area. They're still negotiating market access at this point, phase one. How can market access commitments be made and aligned with where you need to get cheap inputs that can help you build up your circular economy? So this could be types of materials you need for eco-design, the types of materials to set up the recycling plants and things. How do you make sure that you get those at low tariffs or zero tariffs so you can be competitive and build up this industry? So it's a bit like the environmental goods agreement, but then adding products that are relevant for the circular economy. Similarly on services, services, as we also heard earlier already, are absolutely key, and an investment in some of these sectors to building competitive capacity for developing countries in some of these key, recycling, waste management, etc. industries. Get schedules have some categories that are relevant, but not all of them. So this may require expanding the list of categories that countries may want to liberalize services in, so they can get the right investment. Another idea in this context would be basically standards. TBT chapters are in most technical barriers to trade are in most trade agreements. They're typically quite general, but there's a little bit of a movement that you see, especially in the kind of deeper integration agreements, to get more specific, get more product and sector specific. So countries would agree to recognize each other's standards, or through mutual recognition agreements or harmonization or things like that, aligning it to an international standard, so that any friction because of different types of standards that say the Netherlands has or Belgium have with respect to the same product get eliminated or reduced. So that's another area where free trade agreements can come in. And there's a few more, but I'll just highlight those. And then related to that as well is on the alignment part, the flip side is making sure free trade agreements don't undermine commitments made in the environmental sphere. So as everyone knows, the environment and trade are typically are regulated by separate regimes, and they don't overlap as well. And so it's important to be very aware of how in certain areas trade agreements could serve to undermine progress made under, for example, the Basel Convention. I'm just going to stop with one example here, but there was an article in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago where it was about the United States-Kenya Free Trade Agreement. And basically it talked about how the fossil fuel and chemical industry was lobbying the USTR to get Kenya to remove its regulation that was banning single-use plastic, but also to use the trade agreement to get Kenya to import basically plastic garbage. And the amendment to the Basel Convention that is on plastics and basically is trying to make it more difficult for countries to import plastic that's not easy to recycle and to require informed consent. Well, these two movements don't really align. So how can trade agreements be used to, at a minimum, not undermine the progress that's being made internationally? I think that is another area And then there's categorization and definitions, but I know that there's a lot more to be said on this panel, so we won't go into that.
Thank you, Colette. That's amazing. It's also great that you talked about trade agreements with such passion, which I very much can relate to, and also with passion as to how can trade agreements be made better to work for this, in all possible ways. So those were really concrete examples of that. Thank you for that. I'm going to move to Anngrete next, but Colette, you have a question in a QA box. If you can see that, maybe that's something you can answer, because I'm looking at the time and I'm thinking, we will be, if not running out of time, but I think we will have to be double tasking in terms of, having all our panelists and commentators heard while also taking in some questions. So I hope you can see the QA question, and maybe you can, use the chat to answer that. And if you can't, yeah, super. Then we'll, you pick it up while listening the others. But with that, I'm going to move on. Thanks, Colette, to Anngrete. So Anngrete Braus is a project manager at the International Trade Center, and Anngrete works with SMEs, particularly in developing economies. And building on that, kind of now going specifically into beyond sectors, beyond trends, beyond continents and countries, actually talking about live SMEs businesses. So Anngrete, first question to you would be, what is the level of interest and enthusiasm for businesses that you have experienced in your work while working with this sector to develop circular models, to shift to circular models, and also any change in that in the light of pandemic? So that's my kickoff question to you, and welcome.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for inviting ITC and me representing ITC on this panel. Let's say, first of all, the interest or the enthusiasm of SMEs from developing economies does vary quite a bit. But before I dig into the details, let me maybe talk about what is the type of SME that I am talking about. So as ITC, we're working towards improving competitiveness of SMEs in general, and to help them access to international trade. And with that, we're focusing on circularity, because we see that this really helps them to increase their competitiveness by reducing costs on the one hand, and by increasing revenues on the other hand. And the sectoral focus that we have here is, on the one hand, in agricultural sectors such as tea or coffee, but on the other hand, we're also working in manufacturing sectors such as textiles and clothing. And so in general, we see that the SMEs that we're working with in those commodity value chains, they find themselves already in sometimes difficult situations to compete on the world market. So a transition towards circular economy obviously also poses again another level of challenges to them. And that's why, first of all, when SMEs hear about circularity, they're often a little bit doubtful. So that means their understanding of circular economy is not the same that we have. So they would think, for instance, of secondhand clothing imports, which would diminish their own production. Or they would think of the import of secondhand or used cars. And that, of course, gives from the start a negative impression. Then the second thing is that they do not always see the business case right away. So what they see is that they gain stricter requirements from the buyers that they are supplying to, but that there is no increase in the sales price that they get for it in return. So this, again, has a negative connotation to them. And then finally, they also think that maybe, given that circularity is a systemic change in how we operate in our economy, it's the government that should also help them to change. And it's not themselves that really need to come up. These are some of the impressions that we have received from the SMEs that we work with. On the other hand, there are also factors that impact on their willingness. So and there, let me mention, first of all, two primary ones. An SME, first of all, that sees the business case is really interested in circularity. So, and that is, of course, because SMEs as businesses, they're interested in what pays. And if something pays, then, of course, they're interested in implementing it. And then the other very primary factor is then the buy-in of top management. So that means if you have a CEO that really sees that reducing the environmental impact of their company is something that they would like to focus on, then also the company and all other employees, they will follow. So this is really the two primary factors, the business case and the company top management. And we even had one company, for instance, in Tunisia, where they say, we don't really see the business case. It doesn't really make a difference to us, but we're still going for it because we think that our company has to make a positive benefit, contribute positively towards the environmental agenda. Then there are secondary sectors that I would just like to mention. It's also about the sectors that they're active in. So when we're talking about SMEs in agricultural value chains, this pertains to the biological cycle. There it has maybe been more evident from the start what circularity could mean. So for instance, in the coffee sector, we see that byproducts from the washing process are reinserted as fertilizer into the production. So that has been, let's say, more natural. When it comes to manufacturing, there we see that companies are keen to implement the quick wins. So for instance, simply a change in management processes in the textiles, for instance, how they manage their chemicals. But when it comes to larger investments, so for instance, again, in the textile sector, implementing a wastewater treatment plant, that requires a large amount of money, then they are also, again, quite hesitant. The other factor that is very important is the supply relationships they have with international companies. So we've seen that suppliers that deliver to, for instance, European buyers, European brands in the textile sector, that push for circularity, that push for environmental standards, then the suppliers are also more prone to implement those. So buyers really have a say or a key influence in moving towards circularity. And then the final point I would like to mention is also obvious, but it's about finance, it's about incentives, and that, I'm not going to go into the details. I think that is very evident to all of us. And then, so what do we see? How do those companies then engage really into circularity once they are convinced? Most of them, they start what we call with resource efficiency. So they would manage how they consume water, how they consume energy, etc., and really take that as a basis, looking at it from an internal company perspective. Then the second step is moving towards creating a business model out of that. So really thinking about how can I turn my company into something that operates circular in its context. So for instance, in Ethiopia, we worked with one company that produced recycled fabric, and they bought the offcuts from other garment producers and turned them into new fabric, which would then again be made into clothing by other companies. So that there you really see a circular value chain. And then the third level, as I call it, the servicification. That is something that I personally have not seen, but there's definitely opportunity in that space. And that maybe also to what Anthony said earlier, maybe that is something for the future where you can see rental models or something as we see now in European countries where companies rent clothing or they rent shoes on a subscription basis. Now, finally, you also asked about the impact of the pandemic. And of course, what we saw really in the beginning was complete turn towards business survival. And there was no more interest in implementing further circularity and models, but it was really about, okay, how can we restart our production? How can we find the demand again? And that now is sort of easing off. And we see that companies are interested again. And that is, of course, also because there's a general trend towards more sustainability, more circularity, and they have to answer to those demands. And those companies that are focusing on that are the ones that are returning stronger. International buyers are also more and more focusing on this, and with the consolidation of their supply bases, they will obviously pick the suppliers that can adhere to certain standards. And then, of course, the pandemic is also a test for what might happen in the future with regards to climate change. We saw differences in where certain countries or sectors were able to still supply, whilst others were already shut down. So it's also an opportunity to rebalance those supply chains and to use COVID as to make supply chains more resilient.
Thank you, Anchette. That was a really useful, more detailed look in terms of what's happening behind. As I've seen this discussion going for this panel, is that we first look at even a continental level and country level, then we look at trends, and then now you give an insight as to what are those players thinking, which are basically also will be responsible for those trends or implementing those trends or taking up those opportunities. And what I hear from you is that there's some buy-in, but not fully. So there's still, one could say, maybe some convincing needed or some also support needed. And support can also very strongly come through trade, via countries who are importing from a certain area, setting up some standards, and then also supporting the exporter countries to match those standards as well. So then it becomes becomes a positive trend, hopefully in the future. But that was really, really interesting and useful for all of us to hear and get that insight from you. My follow-up question to you will be the obvious one then, what can trade do? You already talked about those, those standards and standard setting, but in addition to that, what can trade policy and trade space do to help the SMEs, convince them to be part of the circularity and facilitate that as well?
Yeah, indeed, that's a really good question. And let me first say that trade policy overall is really crucial for us to move towards a circular economy. And that, for me, is for two reasons. The first one is because it can serve as a facilitator or as an accelerator even for the transition towards a circular economy, because it can mobilize certain flows. And the other reason is that from the SME perspective, trade policy is really crucial because it decides upon the competitiveness of a company or of a certain product on the world market. And if the regulation is favorable for a product, then it can also be successful. So that really to say that trade policy is crucial for this transition to circularity. Still, trade policy, and Colette also mentioned that, it has to strike a difficult balance. On the one hand, we want to push for circularity and in order to reduce environmental consequences that we currently see. But on the other hand, we also do not want to hurt developing country economies and their SMEs through stricter regulation, etc., which they might not be able to cope with. So what does this mean in the end for trade policy? We really need trade policy that is broader than what we've seen traditionally. That traditionally we would look at what is happening at the border. What kind of regulations can we have in order to facilitate the transfer of goods? But we need policy that is broader and that integrates this circular thinking from the start at the design stage. And Colette also, she talked to that about harmonization, specifications of, for instance, content of recycled products in recycled content in a product, about the tariffs on environmental goods. So really, thinking this really broad as opposed to only at the border. Then the second point is that often trade agreements now have moved to integrating a single chapter, for instance, on sustainability. And for me, I'm already very happy that this is happening, but I think we should also there take the next step. And we talk about mainstreaming, right? Mainstream it all over and make also reference to the SDGs. All of the countries basically have subscribed to the SDGs. And this is also something that we want to see in trade agreements and which will also help us move towards the circular economy. And then finally, what is important is that the trade agreements, and both Anthony and Colette, they also talked to that, are consistent with what is happening at the local policy level. So that trade policy interacts well with educational policy, with innovation policy, with industrial policy. So that, for instance, if an international company now wants to set up a recycling plant in a developing country, that the local country is able to set up the supply chains for that. That such a plant, for instance, can, when we're talking about electronics, that scrap goods can be delivered, that there is expertise locally in order to do the recycling process, etc. So that, all policies basically move into one direction of circularity.
Thank you for that, Anne-Colette. I could not agree more with, as I call it, unboxing the sustainability in trade agreements and moving that more mainstream space rather than one chapter. And what you said about more, not only trade policy that happens at the border, but seeing it much more broadly, more holistically. I think that's the European EU developments vis-a-vis the Circular Economy Action Plan, I think are very good example of that. So in a way, and that's a domestic policy, EU domestic policy, which has great impacts and interactions with trade, but basically the policy developments that have trade impacts is happening in a more sort of in a different space than the trade agreements themselves. And there needs to be a dialogue between those two to actually then have a broader, more holistic and sustainable trade policy for circular economy as a whole. So that's obviously a space to be watched, also perhaps globally as well, to learn how this interaction can be best made for the best of everybody. But thanks for that. That was great. And that gives me a really good segue to our last panelist, that is Kimberly Boatwright, who is community lead on global trade and investment at the World Economic Forum. And Kimberly also works with a lot of businesses and therefore is well placed to, I think, build on what Anngrete has been talking about. So how businesses are taking up circular economy and what does it mean specifically for their supply chains as well? And how can trade policy hinder these circular business strategies or support these strategies rather? So with that, Kimberly, over to you. Welcome.
Thank you, and echoing the other panelists to you for putting this great exchange together. So I have been in a fortunate position to work with various businesses over the last 6 months and to look at how they are really for the last decade starting to move towards the circular economy, but seeing that accelerate and become more of a mainstream conversation in recent years. So I'm going to give a couple examples of how companies are moving towards the circular economy and then dive into what that might mean for their supply chain. So examples might include the French-based company Schneider Electric now generates about 12% of its revenues from recycled activities, and that includes things like prolonged product lifespan, but also take-back schemes throughout its supply chain. Similarly, Philips, which is a large healthcare technology provider, aims to generate about 15% of sales from circular products and services by the end of this year. AB InBev, the world's largest brewer, has committed to have 100% of its product to be in recycled packaging by 2025, and around half of its drinks are already sold in returnable glass bottles. And the last example is Apple has committed to make their products from entirely 100% recycled and renewable materials by 2030. It's built the robots Daisy and Dave, who you might have heard about. Daisy disassembles iPhones and Dave disassembles the iPhone's taptic engines, which is what makes the screen tactile, to recover materials like rare earth elements and put those back into new iPhones. So those are just 4 very scratching the surface examples. Most mainstream companies are thinking about this now. So what does that mean for them, the supply chain? So these are quite large commitments that companies are making to use recycled materials, to innovate, put in place alternative materials, and to deliver products as services for greater lifespan. What it means is that they have to think about reverse logistics just as much as they were previously thinking about forward logistics, because we do still live in a world of global, if not predominantly regional value chains. And due to the way that trade and environmental governance has evolved over the years, that means that companies have to take a close look at what materials can be moved from one location to another location based on international requirements stemming from the Basel Convention, but also then national requirements. And that one's quite important because we do have quite a patchwork in terms of requirements around different materials. And again, those requirements very much depend on the material that we're talking about whether it's hazardous, what country classifies it as hazardous, and so on and so forth. So in a new paper that we have just released, we collected insights from electronic firms on managing their reverse supply chain. And several actors cautioned that reverse logistics for used electronic products, represented a 31% increase over outbound logistics of new products. So that's 31% more expensive to get a used product back to wherever you need it to get to than it is to get the new product to a consumer. And for a product that would be categorized as waste, it would be 190% more expensive to get that hazardous product back to wherever you need to get it to. So these are the types of considerations that companies need to take into account in terms of the cost based on what the current system, how the rules currently are in the system. And I think in electronics, it's worth saying that these differentials are more problematic because end-of-life products, whether used or really at the end of their life and needing to be recycled, are not subsidized by the service they provide in the same way that a new product would be. So they're only worth the cost of the extracted materials, and every additional reverse logistic cost, which can include things like extra paperwork, sitting at a warehouse because the permit didn't arrive or because it got blocked in transit or whatever it is, every single extra cost that detracts from the viability of that circular economy business model.
Thanks, Kimberly. So basically what you're saying is that from the business perspective, we still do need to get the system right. So, in terms of on the nitty-gritty level, even beyond policy, looking at the regulations, that and the standards and all that needs to, that system isn't quite there yet to enable them to best take the opportunities and advantages of the circular economy. That's kind of what I get from it. Yes.
Yeah, that's right. So I think the circular economy has gone from something that has grown in traction, and I think companies, countries, consumers all see a big need for the circular economy. If we are to continue to produce and meet prosperity as well for the billions of new consumers coming online, and just electronics that will be being able to buy these products, but also new innovations that will drive new growth, then we will need more of these materials, and there will continue to be opportunities for extraction, but there has to be a greater circularity in the system. And the system as it has currently been set up, partly because I think the trade community does not necessarily interact as frequently as it should with the environmental community, the system just does not incentivize these reverse supply chains. I don't think trade policymakers have spent a lot of time thinking about these reverse supply chains. It's quite a new concept. And in terms of the Basel Convention, while that's a critical piece of environmental governance, the focus is predominantly on risky trade. The Basel Convention is designed to stop waste dumping in developing countries, and that's a really, really good thing. However, it's not been designed for the kind of circularity of materials that we're talking at scale. Because if we're talking at scale, there are some products that are going to have to move across borders for efficiency, some materials that are going to have to move across borders. And the way that things are currently classified, and also the thinking around how you facilitate safe and responsible trade, hasn't really been done. You've seen the European Union doing a little bit of that with pre-consent facilities and some interesting provisions in their waste agreement. But those equally, even within the European Union, that type of facilitative responsible trade hasn't really been taken up in terms of how do you ensure that can we give faster border clearance or fewer, let's say, border compliance checks for product that's going to a facility that we know is a sound, high quality recycling service.
Thanks, Kimberly. Final and hopefully very brief question to you is, in that context then, what business and opportunities can you see there for the developing economy specifically? So in this sort of, if we move into this hopefully new way of doing business and new way of resources moving in a more circular manner also globally, what happens and what opportunities are there for developing economies? Maybe, as a concrete example from the businesses you've been working with, or business sectors you've been working with.
Yeah, so I think there is, writ large, and to speak in a very general sense, there's two options. So if you're a developing economy, you can think about attracting investment. Colette spoke about that before, in repair, remanufacturing, or recycling services. So for example, in Rwanda, investment in one electronics recycling facility has created employment for around 400 people. But worth saying that site actually only operates at 30% capacity. And the fact that that site is only operating at 30% capacity is in part due to the lack of used or waste coming into that. So then we have to think about, I think, as Anne Greta was just saying, how do we make sure that the flows are coming in once you have that investment for it to actually then be viable? There is a risk, conversely, that sites that don't operate at full capacity or that end up bleeding capital because of this, they tend to then slip on the standards. In terms of either in relation to employee safety or in terms of environmental harm. So again, we want to make sure that these any kind of recycling, remanufacturing, repairing service is operating at a high quality level. And again, to do that, it needs to be a well-functioning business with the right inputs. So that's one option. And just coming on to what FTAs can do, there have been some FTAs that have included commitments on the use of science and risk-based approaches for regulating chemicals and introducing sound chemical management frameworks. And I think the US-Kenya FTA example that was raised earlier is an interesting and controversial one. I think it could be taken one way as importing plastic rubbish into Kenya, but conversely, if you're an economy that's looking to become a leader in electronics or plastics recycling, you've got to make sure you've got a sound chemicals management framework. So can we have FTAs raising the bar in terms of the types of international standards that should be used for that? So again, we make sure that we have these high quality services that are being offered. Okay, so then your second option, if you're a developing country, if you're not in the business or don't want to be looking at attracting investment into recycling, repair, or remanufacturing services, and you want to get whatever is in your country rather than it being dumped in landfills, you want to get it out to be recycled elsewhere. How can you create jobs through that? Well, there you can look at developing partnerships along the value chain. So there have been some interesting examples. There's one company called Closing the Loop that's worked in Nigeria to collect over 5,000 kilograms of scrap batteries through the country's informal sector. So you work there with the local pickers and then in partnership send it for processing in Belgium to a high standard facility. And again, there's the opportunity to generate lots of jobs that are probably in the informal sector at the moment. You can work on formalizing them. I think Annegret made a great point about education there as well. But these types of partnerships need to be explored through business and government together, because I think government going it alone, that type of partnership wouldn't necessarily evolve, but there's definitely a public-private opportunity there.
Great, thanks for that. Picking up on your final point of the informal sector and particularly waste pickers, just for information, everybody listening and the panelists as well. If you know, Tier Fund is working very much in this space, and they actually in the upcoming couple of years developing together with the waste pickers and a number of businesses developing standards for the informal sector that the businesses should be actually complying to make sure that the waste pickers and that informal sector is being respected and has the conditions required. So this is also what players in this field are picking up, which is absolutely great. And obviously then this should become as part of the standards, more like in a production space, a process space that we would be looking at in the future as well. When we look at is a product being sustainably, circularly and sustainably more broadly produced in a country X. But great, thanks for that, Kimberly. And thank you at this point to all the panelists. So we've gone through our panelist round. And what we'll do next is we'll have a few comments that we have lined up from our remaining partners of this event. So line up ready. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first go to I think I'm going to go first to Malena, to you, so to Sitra, because it will be building quite nicely on what we discussed, and then Elizabeth, you're going to be following. But while Malena and I have a bit of a chat in terms of what Sitra is doing, and some insights from Sitra's side, we have a question from the audience. Asking what role can technical and financial assistance and capacity building play to enable developing and least developed countries to become circular economy compliant, and particularly are new initiatives needed, or can something be built on the existing initiatives as well here? So could panelists think about that, because after Malena, I'll go back to this question and see if anybody from the panel could pick this up, so we also have some discussion with the audience as well. And then after that we'll go to Elizabeth and UNECE. But first, Malena Sell works for the Finnish Innovation Fund Sitra and leads their circular economy trade-related portfolio there. And obviously Sitra works a lot on circular economy in Finland, and now is also increasingly looking at how the insights from Finland can be shared and beneficial also more broadly, globally as well. So Malena, you have a couple of initiatives that you would like to share from Sitra's side, looking at the roadmap for circular economy on a national level that Finland has developed, and other countries could maybe pick up. And also there's a new study coming up specifically in the services sector and circular economy and services sector, which you might highlight one or two insights from, because the circular economy services sector has been mentioned earlier by the speakers as well. So with that, over to you.
Thank you so much, Marianne, and thank you to all of the excellent panelists and the insights that you've brought to the discussion today. Indeed, I'll just spend a few minutes talking about what we at Sitra have been looking at over the last while and where we're looking in the future, and highlighting 3 points really that I think are relevant in this context. And the first one is about the need for global networks and alliances, which this Geneva Global Trade Week is also an example about. In Sitra, we're facilitating the World Circular Economy Forum online, which is happening just at the same moment. And, there are good parts and bad parts of them happening at the same time, but certainly trade is becoming a bigger and bigger part of all discussions that are related to the global transition of the circular economy. And then, secondly, both Colette and Anthony and others talked about how what happens at the national level needs to be aligned with trade policy or trade opportunities. And just yesterday, Sitra has released a new toolbox or guidebook for how to create national circular economy roadmaps, and each country is so different and the opportunities are so different that what we in Finland realized when we sat down and created the first roadmap in 2016, and that was quite a process, engaging all stakeholders, and it was very iterative, allowing to hear different voices and perspectives, is that it's not going to happen overnight. And as we go forward, the trade impacts and possibilities really need to be put into that as well. So in the chat box, I'll share some links related to what I'm talking about and highlighting right here. And so thirdly, as we've already started doing in this event, we really need to go deeper into the role of trade and trade policy cooperation in order to go ahead. And we've talked a lot about the role of standards and standardization, mutual recognition agreements. Great point about reverse logistics. So Sitra, together with the Finnish Ministry of Foreign Affairs and IISD, have been looking at the services side. Now that servicification and digitalization is really enabling the circular economy, this has been a very understudied area. Our study will be out in just a few days, so it will be online at that point. But in terms of specifics, again, the key role of how goods and services are integrated came up here again. So when looking at some of the problems with the services, they're actually related to some of the lack of understanding of circular goods and standards as well. And then there are also the general trends that are hindering services trade at this point that are relevant for companies that we interviewed in our study, such as regulations around data flows or localization requirements, etc. But I know that there are others waiting to speak, so thank you, and I will put some links in the chat.
Super. Thank you, Malena, for that. And please do put links in the chat, and please make sure that the links go to everybody, not just the panelists. So click the right box there, because I'm kind of monitoring it and trying to see that happens. But so there was a question asked before we have our second commentator from the organizers side, Elizabeth. So Elizabeth, stay ready. So there was a question which was about technical and financial assistance and the role of that. Should we build on existing initiatives or have something else? Anybody from the panel quickly happy to reflect on that?
I can provide one perspective to that. So I would definitely say that the existing technical assistance is definitely the basis that we can build upon. So, and this is when we're again talking about mainstream. We do not need to reinvent the wheel completely, but it's about integrating circular economy perspectives in the developmental work, which is anyways ongoing, and to diminish the trade-offs between certain aspects that the environment might have on gender or on inclusion topics, etc. So integrating these things into existing developmental assistance. And the important thing here is that, of course, it sounds trivial, but the collaboration aspect that Malena also highlighted is key here, and that is where development assistance maybe can play a good role of bringing together the different actors. Because again, from the SME perspective, they might be in their business environment and doing what they're good at, running their business, but maybe bringing those external insights that might be needed in order to move towards the circular production concept or even a circular value chain, and to connect those stakeholders, defining business cases, helping them to access finance, bringing in associations that might have expertise, local institutions, and also bringing the voice of the SMEs to policymakers. So this connecting all the different partners in the circular economy, that can be one key role of development assistance, and that can be integrated in what already has been done.
Great, thanks, Anne-Colette. And the one thing I'm going to mention here is just 3 words: aid for trade, as a mechanism that exists in the EU, but also more broadly as a mechanism that can and should be directed more towards supporting circularity and shift to that. There's a delightful number of comments now coming through the chat and also QA. So please, the panelists, in the interest of time as well, do take a look. There are really interesting and good questions there. For example, one question is about whether countries which produce and export raw materials, are they doing any work internally, nationally, to look at how to offset the jobs that in the future might be lost in the raw material export sector, to actually compensate that in other sectors and developing other sectors? And are there any examples of that? And Colette has already answered that for her knowledge. She hasn't seen not much in a national development strategy level in such countries, but some snippets of proactivity can be seen in certain countries. But if anybody wants to also pick up on that, because that is really the interesting thing, how can on a national level this shift happen when trends in circularity change as well? But a number of other interesting comments as well. So please, panelists, do take a look while we do have 15 minutes left. But as promised, I'm going to go next to Elizabeth. So Elizabeth Turk is director at the Economic Cooperation and Trade Unit, United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, so UNCE. And Elizabeth is going to have a few minutes to talk about and highlight the building interest in circular economy in the transition economies. So in transition economies, what is the foreseen future role of circular economy? Is there traction at the moment? And where are we going in that space? And also, obviously, what can trade do to help? So Elizabeth, over to you. You have a couple of minutes to capture this very, very small question, if at all possible. Just give us a bit of an idea as to where you guys are going. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Marianne. And let me start by thanking all the organizers for having UNECE, the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, be part of this really collaborative and fruitful event. It's been a pleasure to listen. I learned a lot and I got ideas about how to carry that forward. And I'd love to share with you a little bit where we are coming from. As you may know, the member states of UNECE, that's 56 member states from 3 continents, North America, Europe, Asia, notably Central Asia, they have decided that the theme of our next Commission session in spring, it will be promoting circular economy and the sustainable use of natural resources in the UNECE region. So coming to the point mentioned before, indeed there is traction also in our region, in the developing and transition economies region, for the importance of that topic. So now in the Secretariat, we are all in full force preparation for living up to member states' expectations. And if we look at our region, we really see here that we have front runners on circular economy, and I'm very much looking to our EU member states here. But we also have member states that are maybe less sensitized so far. And Anthony, Colette, but also Annegret, they've all referred to the North-South issues in their intervention. And that's really relevant for us in UNECE, to flag the challenges and to flag the needs of the transition economies. So transition economies in Central Asia, in Caucasus, in the Western Balkan, and maybe also picking up on one of the questions from the chat room, when we talk about development assistance and when we talk about what donors can do and what the different agencies can do, I would make here a call to say, focusing on developing countries, and please, developed countries is of crucial importance, but do not forget the transition economies. They have different needs, they are in a different context, and it's very, very important to also bring them into the loop when we talk about circular economy. So with that in mind, let me flag 3 concrete examples of UNECE's normative instruments, 3 regulations normative instruments are the core of UNECE work. And these three regulations, how they can make a concrete contribution to our joint effort to transition to a more circular economy. The three normative instruments that I chose for you, they all have a clear trade dimension. They can make a contribution to building back better. And they also respond to some of the things that have been said before. For example, Colette, you flagged the need for data, you flagged the need for design elements for production design and so forth. And most importantly, because we had so many references to trade agreements already, when we look at the UNECE normative instruments, they are not hardcore enforceable rules, such as the trade rules, but they are softer international rules, efforts that can help support the implementation of the trade rules. So what are my three examples and use cases? First, the United Nations Framework Classification for Resources. That dates back as early as 2009. And it's particularly relevant right now because the covered resources, for example, copper, cobalt, lithium, rare earth elements, they're all finite and they're all in high demand and being traded globally. So our framework convention, what it does, it can help provide reliable and coherent data on the availability and the sourcing of these critical raw materials. This framework convention is universal, so internationally applicable, and we have several schemes continent-wide where they are being implemented. Let me start with Europe. The European Commission is using UNFC to manage the critical raw materials needed for battery production. So we see a very concrete application here. In Africa, the initiatives to implement the convention are led by the African Union Commission. In Eurasia, we have pilot projects with the Russian Federation, and in the Americas, the efforts are led by Mexico. So we can see really concrete use cases of these international rules. Second highly relevant normative instrument is Regulation 133. That's not a very name that is very good for advertising, but it's quite relevant when it comes to approving motor vehicles, cars. And what it does is it looks at their reusability, recyclability, and recoverability. So these three dimensions, there is a clear link to the circular economy. And for the type of vehicles that are covered by this regulation, it sets out quantitative targets for reusability, recyclability, and recoverability, namely 85% and 95%. So that is measured in terms of the mass of the vehicle. And when we think about trade in automotives, again, there is a clear trade dimension here. Also interesting for you to look at national level laws that are taking these elements, for example, in the European legal context, from these regulations. So again, a very specific use case. My third example, very briefly, is the regulation that is still in the making, and I'm proud to say that this is a regulation being developed by the staff in my division, the Economic Cooperation and Trade Division. We hope it will be adopted in the months to come, and it's about enhancing transparency and traceability of sustainable value chains in garment and footwear. So textiles, leather supply chains, they have a clear and many times actually very concerning environmental and social footprint. It's come up in the debate today as well. And by facilitating the tracing and tracking of what is happening in the supply chain, by identifying sustainability hotspots, thereby that's really an important step to also address these hotspots and improve the sustainability performance and to facilitate reuse. We look at the supply chain here. We've just heard supply chain issues come up many times. And here also let me link that to what Annegret said about the importance of the buyer's power. So what is the power of the buyers vis-a-vis the SMEs? All these are issues also that will be looked at in the context of this regulation. We are rolling it out, I'm very proud to say, through a pilot project where we will use blockchain to do that tracing. And here, an example, again, Egypt and Bangladesh will be use cases and pilots in this regard. So let me close here and tell you again, it's been a great pleasure to listen, to learn. I very much look forward to continuing this engagement. And as we said before, it's about cooperation between different agencies. It's cooperation between different partners. I look forward to being part of this joint endeavor. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you always to everybody who mentions some concrete instruments. Could you please put those names on the chat box, because people might not remember what was the regulation and what number, so we can at least Google them. So that would be great, and make sure it goes to everybody. But with that, we are heading towards a close. So we have 5 minutes left, and what I would want to do with these 5 minutes is not to use them myself, but go back to our 4 panelists with the one final question for each and every one of you, and you have 1 minute. So let's see, whether we can take this up. And my question to you would be, based on what you've heard and, based on what we discussed, what is the one key message you would put forward to the trade negotiators in your space in the future, the trade negotiators to take into consideration, take up to make sure we will get globally business-oriented, sustainable, and also development economy-oriented circular economy trade going that will help to recover as well? So 1 minute, one message. Anthony, would you care to go first?
Yeah, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
We can, yeah. Hello.
Yeah, I think my first message would be that every trade negotiation should be deeply embedded in the national development plans of each of those countries, whether they're developing countries or countries in transition, that it needs to align with the other policies of that. But for us on the African continent, I would really call on the support to the Africa Continental Free Trade Area and Agreement. These are going to be very vital. The more we develop within Africa, the less pressure we put on Europe and others. So it's a win-win situation. Thanks.
Super. That is clear. Thank you so much, Anthony. And thanks you also for joining us this very early morning for you. Colette, over to you next.
Thank you so much. I would say the importance of being holistic, because, just to briefly go back to the AFCFTA, the environment isn't really featured in that agreement. There's other elements that are important, but that's not there. So typically agreements focus on the anti-poverty, the diversification, digitalization, the environment, renewables, circular economy, but they're not approached holistically, in part because trade negotiators are also negotiating in silos and are not always talking to the environmental ministry or other types. So I think the importance of having a holistic strategy that includes the circular economy going forward, and thereby creating the institutions that enable for that kind of policy making to work, I think would be my message. Thanks.
Thank you, Colette. And thank you also for joining us this morning. Annegret, you are next.
Mm-hmm. My key message is that, trade negotiators, I would encourage them to really connect to the companies that are impacted by the trade policy, to really go back, interview them, listen to their concerns about how circularity is integrated in trade agreements, and then really try to make this positive for them. Try to set incentives through trade policy so that companies can really see a business case through the trade policy. That's my key message.
Thank you, Annegret. And Kimberly, last but not least, what is your key message to the trade negotiators of the future?
Thanks very much. It's very similar to Annegret's, and I would just flag that according to our platform for accelerating the circular economy, today the global economy is only 8.6% circular. Just 2 years ago, that was 9.1. So we've actually gone backwards. So this is an absolute appeal for trade negotiators to get involved. I don't think we have all the answers yet, but that's not a bad thing. So to echo what Annegret said, my recommendation is go further in dialogue with companies, but also with NGOs that are helping those companies to achieve those circular economy goals. Figure out what the specific acupuncture trade intervention is, and try and get those figures going in the other direction.
Thank you, Kimberly. With that, it's time to say thank you to all the panelists. Warm-heartedly, thank you for all your contributions and all your insights. What we tried to build here is a sort of, starting from a higher level, looking at trends, linking that to more concretely the doers and players who are the businesses, and also linking to recovery. I hope that listeners have also been able to follow us in this space, to see how these different things link together and how they are enabling us and allowing us to build back better, as the message and the call for this morning was. In short, I think we all concluded that circular economy, yes, we can, but we also very much need cooperation here. And to bring us to Geneva, to bring us to WTO, that is, of course, where a lot of cooperation and dialogue happens in that space. And WTO members are indeed interested in circular economy. So hopefully, in Geneva in the future, the negotiators hear us and will take this up as well. So thank you, panelists, thank you, audience, and thank you also all the organizers. And before and finally, I would like to say a special thank you for somebody who hasn't been saying anything this morning, but has been there on the background and also helping to make this event happen. So Maarit Keitonen, who has been my counterpart to organize the event, working together with me over the past weeks. Maarit, thank you very much. Thank you for the Embassy of Finland as well to helping. But obviously, of course, each and every one of the panelists and each and every one of the participants who have been part of organizing this event. So great thank you to all of you. Let's continue dialogue also after this event and after the Geneva Trade Week. So with that, I thank you and I look forward to seeing you around in different events, building on this agenda in the future. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, bye.